got a question for you before we play today's video. Have you ever wondered what your family tree looks like? Well, I have, and I am not going to lie. I have become a little on the obsessed side with my family history. So MyHeritage, who is my absolutely fabulous sponsor for today's video, has helped me to find out so much information about my ancestors. It is literally mind-blowing. So for example, I have literally been able to trace back my relatives on my father's side all the way back to the 1700s. I've even been able to find out the careers that some of my relatives have had. So I now know that my great-great-great-granddad on my mother's side owned a pub called the Seven Stars in Sheffield. And also, really interestingly for me, my dad's family were farm owners. It's a bit like discovering a whole new world all about me, all about where I come from. So for those of you who don't know MyHeritage, well, they are the leading global service for family history research and also DNA testing. They're trusted by 90 million users. And one of the things that I love about MyHeritage is it has made building my family tree so easy. Also, one of the great additions is that they give you so many tools that mean that you can research your family history and also grow your family tree. Now, MyHeritage is home to more than 15 billion searchable historical records. That's why I found out so much about my family. There are also some awesome additions that just make the site so usable and easy to use, because you can use their advanced AI technologies to repair, enhance, colorize, and literally animate historical family photos. They bring them to life in front of your eyes. I have loved and continue to love going on my family history adventure. And one of the great things about today's sponsor is they're letting me share with you an incredible offer, which means that you can do exactly the same as me. It's entirely free, it won't cost you a penny, and you can sign up for a 14-day trial, which means that you can enjoy all the amazing features the site has to offer. So that means 2 whole weeks free where you can search for your family roots and find out where they lie. And if you decide to continue your subscription, well, you will get a huge 50% discount. And who knows, you may even discover that we are related. What is not to love about that? Let's get on with today's video. True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thanks for joining me. As was noted in my last video, I am a little bit battered and bruised, shall we say. I have had quite severe nose surgery. My face does not look like it normally looks. So if some of you are like, oh my God, I've been watching a crime channel and this woman looks uncannily like the woman in another crime channel, but just a kind of little bit different, it's because it is me, just after quite significant surgery. And it's great because my face is just swelling in different areas every day, so it keeps it fresh and new, if nothing else. Thanks before I start getting into today's case, which all of you have asked for, so I've finally relented and done this one. I just want to take a moment to say thank you to my Patreon subs. Thank you for just listening to the podcasts that are on there. Thank you so much for your support. It makes a huge difference to me. And also to you little green named members that pop up on my live chat and everybody who's joined my membership. Thank you so much. Again, it always helps to make better content. It gives me more opportunity to just immerse myself in said cases. Today's case is going to be difficult. It's one involving child murder. We all know how I feel about child murder. Murder per se, of course, because every life lost to murder is something inexcusable and preventable. But when it comes down to child death, just because kids are completely innocent, They do not have any power. There is a helplessness that they experience in their day-to-day life, and they are completely reliant on their caregivers to protect and look after them. And when that fails, I find it rage-inducing. I find it beyond reprehensible. And the infuriation level that I experience, even when researching this, is something that I know is what we would expect to experience as a well-adjusted, loving human. Because adult humans, even teenagers and young children, know that little babies and infants need the most care and attention. And we're just hardwired to act upon that and deliver it. When primary caregivers fail to do that, it's blindsiding for me. As a woman who would have liked, 20 children, it makes me feel that there is a real world of unfairness out there where people don't even get to have kids, and yet, like the woman and associated parties in this that I'll cover today, some people are blessed with the title mother, but really don't ever deserve to have that used in context with them whatsoever. They simply fail on every level as far as being a nurturer and a carer is concerned. Today's case was so provocative when it happened, so evocative, so damning in so many different ways, that it actually led to a really big inquiry and to some changes, which is always positive. But I do feel that more and more in the cases that I cover, we tend to be telling the same story again and again, which is that change should have occurred. And yet, when I think about Starr Hobson and Arthur Lambino, all of these cases that have occurred recently, I'm struggling to find whether progress has been made. Maybe it's just me because I spend so much time researching these cases and working in this area, but genuinely, the words "we must do better" are something that remain resonant now as they were when I heard about this case. So let's look at what happened in the Baby P case. And I appreciate that lots of you will have heard of Baby P, but you may not know what occurred in the crime, and also, shall we say, the individuals who created that storm and where they came from. And so hopefully today I'm going to be able to alert you to the histories of Baby P's caregiver, primary caregiver, his mother, and also look at the chaos and the tragedy that ensued around the loss of this beautiful, angelic looking baby boy. So Tracey Connolly, that's his mother. She's born in Leicester on the 29th of June 1981, and she lived with her mother. Her mother was called Mary O'Connor. She lived with a stepfather, Gary Cox. He was a travelling salesman. She had an older brother as well. Now, Mary was a drug user. She also had alcohol issues, so there were dependency issues within the household. That is going to be difficult. If you're a child being brought up with a dependent parent, even if that dependent parent absolutely adores you, you are not going to be first in line all the time and prioritised because the individual struggles with their own dependency issues. So for Mary, there were complex reasons which potentially led to her drug dependency and alcohol issues. So as a child, she herself had been physically abused by her father, and then she'd also been sexually molested by another relative, which would have been very problematic. She is said to have grown up in a real climate of violence, and it feels as if her own children would experience exactly the same. So even though she had been an individual who had faced the pain, the experience of being a child victim, as opposed to that, changing and altering the way that she wished to bring up her own children, instead it seemed to legitimize it. It gave her a permission base to carry out the kind of crimes that she herself experienced. So her children end up very much living that similar experience per se. Now, Connolly's mother and stepfather, well, they had that volatile relationship, and obviously it comes systemic from having experienced it, as Mary experienced when she was a child. And Connolly and her brother they witnessed domestic violence. Again, we know when it comes down to attachment issues and senses of abandonment and just dealing with the chaos of being in a violent household can have huge implications on children. Just the sense of believing that their world is never safe, looking at their primary caregivers and not really knowing how they're going to react and respond because of the violence that you witness, never truly knowing what it's like to have firm foundations. They are all highly problematic when we're bringing up children, because we're meant to, as primary caregivers, be teaching our children how to model behavior. So we are their primary relationships. When a child looks at us and sees the way that we act in our relationships, arguably they are learning, shadowing, shall we say, how to grow into a healthy, well-adjusted human being in relationships, or of course, at times, the alternative. But even when the alternative is occurring, for the majority of people, the vast majority of people, they recognize in early childhood they don't want those kind of relationships and they adjust behavior. It's not a perfect science, we all fall short. But for the vast majority of people, just because you have a horrible experience witnessing domestic abuse at home does not mean that you're going to go on to be a domestic abuser in any way, shape or form. Now, according to Connolly's mother, she said that Gary was a violent sadist. So she felt that she had a partner who was incredibly sadistic, and she said that he was highly controlling, he would regularly beat her, and this led to a point where she became very violent in return, and she ultimately stabbed him in the stomach, and she got 2 years probation because of that. This meant that Connolly and her brother had a lot of chaos, clearly. Now they have a mother who's criminalised in that context. And they do remain living in Leicester. This is until 1984. And it's only at this point that her mother and her stepfather separate. Personally, if somebody stabbed me in the stomach, even if I was a violent perpetrator, I'd probably be thinking this isn't the relationship for me. And secondly, it would have been far better if Connolly's mother had realised that she deserved more than such a controlling partner who was violent. But it is never a simple equation when dealing with these cases, is it? But imagine, as siblings, those children have witnessed some pretty terrifying, tragic, dangerous situations. Now, at this point, when Connolly's parents split up, Connolly goes to live with her mother in London, but her brother remains with his father in Leicester. So she also goes through that dysfunction of having initially lived with a sibling and all the things that involves, the good and the bad. We all know what it's like to have the good in sibling relationships, someone to play with, watch movies with, hang out with. We all know the bad as well, such as when you borrow one of their tops and, shall we say, are punished greatly for it. Might have happened to me in my childhood, learn not to take sisters' tops. But you know what I mean, there's good and bad, and it creates a volume and a beauty in your childhood when you've got siblings. To suddenly find yourself separated, it can create such questions as, why is mum taking me? And does dad not want me? And so on and so forth, and reflected on both sides. So her brother remains with Gary at this point, his father, but then Gary dies. And this is an unexpected death. It happens in March 1988. So at that point, her brother then moves in with his mother and sister in London. It is worth noting that Gary apparently died in her brother's arms. So for that young man, that child growing up, you can't imagine, can you, how powerfully upsetting that would be. I have a friend who lost her father and he died in her arms, and she remembers it in technicolor. She remembers the sights, the smells, all of it, the helplessness, because she was a kid, and how do you ever know how to manage those situations? And certainly for Connolly's brother, this would have been highly traumatizing without a doubt. He even tried to give him the kiss of life, which is heroic for a young child. It really is, isn't it? There's somebody who is actually actively trying to save his father, And that whole incident is said to have began a scenario where Connolly's brother started going off the rails. It really did affect his behaviour. That is not uncommon. We see that traumatic events can play out in a whole different range of ways, but bear in mind the prescription that they've already had in childhood as far as toxicity and violence, and now ultimately we have father dying in child's arms. Oh, that's going to cause so many issues, and acting out and having an impact on the world around you, we can do that positively or negatively. But it gives us a sense of visibility, and also it creates symptomatic behaviours, doesn't it? So we're acting out because of our pain, it's causing us more pain in return, but at least we're getting noticed that something isn't right. And it feels like at that point he should have been afforded a huge amount of help, because to go through that is very challenging. And if you then see a change in that child's behaviour, it's not because they're a bad kid, is it? It's because they're a kid who's had really bad things happen to them and they don't know how to process it. Now, throughout her childhood, Connolly had actually believed that her stepfather was her actual biological father. So she had been brought up thinking that she was a full sibling to her brother and that her parents had essentially created her. She found out at the age of 12 it wasn't actually the case. She discovered that Gary, the man that she believed was her father, was actually only her older brother's biological father, but not hers. And to add, shall we say, a little bit of insult to injury based on, oh, that's really difficult, I've just found out you're not my biological father even though you're dead. Question, who's my biological father? That's just going to be the thing that comes, isn't it? Goes hand in hand. Who is my father then? Well, imagine sitting your kid down. Got a bit of a story to tell you on that one, Connolly. A little bit of a, shall we say, awkward conversation to have, but you have asked about who your father is, so let me sit you down and tell you. Well, you were conceived when your stepfather paid another man to have sex with me whilst your stepfather watched. That's how you were conceived. So you're basically saying I was conceived through a pretty sordid liaison. Yeah, essentially that's how it happened. Also, if this doesn't strike you as concerning enough, Connolly's actual biological father reportedly had 16 children to various women. For those of you who've watched Mick Philpott, the episode I covered with him, he has a very similar mindset to that kind of man. These people exist in our societies like they think that their sperm is the most important thing in the world, when actually they are just going around and neutralising and then decimating intelligent life forms. If you haven't seen the Mick Philpott one, I'll link it so you can. It's a treat, that particular video. But he definitely fits this kind of mindset. So now she's found out that her father just goes around impregnating women. Also, he's some kind of guy who doesn't mind getting involved in sexual voyeurism, allowing other men to witness him having sex with their partners. But if that wasn't quite enough to make Connolly be like, Mum, you definitely need to have made better life choices, it turns out that her biological father was also a sex offender. I mean, when it comes down to the lottery ticket of possibility where parents are concerned, she didn't even get a number, did she? Not one number. There was no bonus ball creeping in to that parenting scenario. So she says that when she found out that her father was literally the lowest of the low, strangest of the strange, why on earth did you ever invite him into our world even for 30 seconds? It turned her into, as she says, a wild child for a while. So she noticed that it affected her behaviour. Unsurprisingly, if your mother and your stepfather are making life choices like this, you're already starting way behind the normal starting blocks, aren't you? You're already dealing with a whole heap of psychological, emotional issues. Now, it does seem that her mother's separation from her very abusive stepfather, although we also have to acknowledge that her mother did stab him, which doesn't sound like a very pro-social thing to do, but you would imagine that that would change at least the landscape of childhood. You know, it's been imperfect, it's been challenging, there's lots of issues, we can feel a great level of empathy with Connelly growing up in that situation, but you would imagine that once there is that separation, there would be a hope that family life would improve. But it didn't. It didn't improve life for Connelly or her brother. They had a huge amount of issues settling into their new home. Now, as I've noted, her brother's behaviour became very challenging. He became very violent at school, and also he became very violent towards his sister at home. So we're seeing that cycle of domestic abuse continuing. So her brother is now targeting her, and he's taking on those traits, isn't he, that he's seen at home. But also, I will acknowledge, he probably is in a deep sense of pain, and at the same time is confused about how he feels, who he is, what's gone on. And also we have to look to the primary role models, his caregivers, to lay the blame at their feet to some degree. But this would be very difficult for Connelly, of course. Home isn't a safe place. She's already been watching and witnessing domestic abuse. She's had the chaos experienced. Now she's got a brother who is doing the same to her. He also gets involved in truanting, crime, all of these kind of petty issues that just add to the family's burden. And he actually attempted to strangle his mother when he was 11. So the rage towards women is very clear. And we could analyse that till our heart is content, but just looking at some obvious insight and connections, he's watched his father do this to his mother for many years. He doesn't necessarily feel that she is somebody that deserves any more than that kind of behaviour, because it's been validated by somebody that he loved. He loved his father in spite of the fact that he was highly imperfect and very abusive. But also, when you haven't taught children how to manage and manifest coping skills with their feelings, violence is something that many will use to express frustration, pain, humiliation, all of these things. And grief would also be a part of that. And certainly this young boy has experienced grief. So this is a real cooking pot of possibility as far as problems in the home and feeling safe in the home for all parties is concerned. It gets to May 1990, and you won't be surprised to find out that Connelly's brother is actually placed on the child protection register. This is not, by the way, because he's being violent towards others. This is actually down to the fact that his mother is physically abusing him. So as much as he is being violent in the home, it's not like his mother has adjusted her behaviour at all. So he goes on the child protection register. So in the UK, the child protection register is a register that essentially makes sure that a child is being monitored. And they can stay on that child protection register for a very long time. You have households who are on it for years, and it never gets to a place where the children are removed. There may be interventions, there may be expectations of parents to change certain behaviours, they may even start doing really well, but social services might say, well, let's just keep them on the child protection register, you know, for a next period of time, and we'll just keep checking in until they're completely confident. But it's there with this idea of knowing how to protect the most vulnerable. So Connelly's brother goes on that. And a year after he goes on that, Connelly herself is placed on the register when she's 11 as well. For her, it's down to issues with neglect. And again, when we look at abuse per se, it's worth noting that when you look at the brains of a child who has been physically abused in comparison to the brain of a child who has been neglected, the neglected child's brain is usually shrunken and less developed. And the reason for that is, even though physical abuse is horrific, there is at least some kind of engagement and interaction. So even though it's horrible, The brain benefits more from that than it does when somebody is completely ignored. So Connolly is being ignored. She isn't being looked after on a personal hygiene level. Her appearance is really going to the dogs, and she's 11 years of age. I appreciate that at 11, a lot of us would have been taking care of ourselves, but if you don't have the facilities, if there isn't the right kind of money to make sure that you have the opportunity to wear clean clothes, you're hardly at this point going to be using a washing machine, sorting out all of your self-care products yourself, and you don't have the finances to do so anyway. It comes down to the fact that mum was just letting it go. She was not parenting effectively at all. When Connolly was asked down the line about what was going on at home during these periods of time, she later claimed that it wasn't just neglect that she was experiencing, she was actually being physically abused as well. She also struggled at school. Now, anybody who has had kids and put those kids in school, and there is a child who looks different, smells different, maybe catches nits, for example, often those children come from households that are less than perfect, and even though that child needs to be compassionately embraced and needs friends more than anyone, often they're singled out and they end up getting bullied. It's a horrible scenario when you imagine that these children are already struggling, but it is something that you see. In fact, more often than not, children who have poor personal hygiene, they look disheveled, they smell in a way that other kids don't smell, they instantly are the kids that get targeted. And she says that that's exactly what happened to her at school. Now, she wasn't an unintelligent child. The reports from her educators are not that she was somebody who didn't have potential, that she was somebody who was of an intelligence level where she could have succeeded. But as she went through school, behaviours got in the way, and she started to develop a very promiscuous reputation. It is unsurprising to me that a girl coming from a neglectful and an abusive household would seek the comfort in the arms of others or anyone. It makes girls and boys incredibly vulnerable in these situations, and getting validation and a sense of self-worth from another person's attention to you, well, that's not uncommon. And I think we can all appreciate as to why people would use those behaviours. She had a horrifically dysfunctional childhood. She had really inconsistent, really abusive parenting. And this started more and more to alert the social services around her and the authorities around her, her education provider, that there was something potentially that she needed more to make sure that her behaviour and her educational needs would be met in a better place and position. So they decide that she needs a special educational provision placement. So instead of going to mainstream secondary school, they believe that there are better options for her. So she subsequently attended a residential reform school in 1993, which makes me feel like we're in the 1800s, a residential reform school. Residential sounds okay. Residential sounds like an activity weekend. Reform makes me feel a little bit like you're sending me to prison. Is it just me? I just feel like the words residential reform school is like, you are the problem. We will residentially reform you over the years. Anyway, that happens in 1993. So she chooses, actually, she's got an opportunity to choose between a couple of places, and she chooses the reform school instead of an Islington children's home. Not a lot of choice there. Seems very different, doesn't it? Islington children's home versus a school. Just throwing it out there. Seems to be some issues, without doubt, in the way that the services perceived her home life, to the point where they just want to get her out. It's as simple as that. They just wanted to go somewhere, I think, safer. Now, she chooses the reform school, and let me tell you, my God, when I was doing my research, did she dodge a bullet? This is one of the only strokes of luck that she has in her life, that she manages to dodge this particular bullet. Because in the 1990s, there's this child abuse scandal that breaks out, and it was uncovered throughout Islington children's homes. So literally, it was a bedrock of child abuse, it really was. One of Connelly's teenage male relatives, he also ended up in a care home, and he actually got targeted by a paedophile ring because of that particular organisation. So she could have ended up there as well. Actually, what's really scary as well is that particular male relative who was targeted by the paedophile ring, he kind of got involved in it in the end. So he helped to lure the children into the system of abuse. It's worth noting that that same male relative who, shall we say, has corrupted and been corrupted because of that system, he did have access to Connelly. And during the 1990s, Connelly was actually sexually abused by him. It's always so blindsiding when you imagine that we send children and young people to these positions and places with the aim of helping them and making them feel better about their world and educating them in a way where they succeed, and then you find out that actually what happened to them is they just went through the most horrific abuse. And even though more and more is done to try to prevent these kind of systems. Look, if you are a predator and you want to abuse children and young people, often you're going to put yourself in a position where you have access to them. And when kids are in care, I don't care what people say out there. I don't care how PC people are when they want to pretend that it's all great and kids have a wonderful time in care. The truth is you are highly disadvantaged if you have been in that system because of the fact that emotionally you will have had some really horrible things happen to you. It might be a miles safer place for you to be in care, but the point is that you don't have the same opportunities as kids who come from loving homes have. And it's really challenging psychologically to deal with that. I know there are some amazing examples of people coming out of the care system and actually thriving brilliantly. But for those who end up in residential care homes, it can be a very scary place. And certainly we have seen time and time again this systemic abuse coming from these institutions because these kind of predators know where to go to get access to vulnerable kids. So in spite of the fact that Connelly has had a very tumultuous, dysfunctional upbringing, she does actually manage to meet her husband when she's 16 years of age. Now, I will note, he was 17 years older than her, which instantly is like, that's not right. She's 16, she's a child and probably one of the most vulnerable kids at this point. 17 years difference is a whole lifetime of hers plus a year. This is worrying. In his defense, she lied to him about her age. But the fact that he's 33 and she's 16, I appreciate she's lying about her age, and we can all agree she's had a pretty hard life. And you know what? A hard life can age you a little bit. But she was 16 and he's 33. Surely he would have noticed that potentially there was an age issue here. Because I just think if you're having a conversation like, you know, how old are you? I'm 33. How old are you? 25? Wow. Can I get the idea about what you're using for your moisturiser? Anyway, he's not a bad guy, by the way, this guy. I'm just giving you the indication that this is vulnerability. I'm just saying there was a huge gap, whether she told him that she was in her 20s and then he was in love with her when she finally relented and told him, I don't know. But they soon got married. So this relationship happens relatively fast, and he would be the father of her first 4 children. And I'm going to be honest, he was a good dad. He really was. He was a good father and he was a good husband. And it's worth noting, think about what she's been through prior to this relationship. There have been high levels of dysfunction. There has been so much neglect and physical abuse. And she manages to find a guy who, okay, he's considerably older than her, but this is somebody who works several jobs to support his family. He was known to cook for the family. He cleaned the house. He wasn't violent. He wasn't abusive. Personally, I think you are winning the lottery of possibilities when you've had a childhood so dysfunctional as Connelly had. She scores as far as meeting somebody who genuinely seems to have her interests and her children's interests at heart. And if she had stayed in that non-abusive, non-threatening, clearly functioning relationship, I would not be telling this story today. Now, on the 1st of March 2006, by this point, Connelly's had 3 daughters. She ends up giving birth to her first son, Peter. And I know that everybody loves their children. I have 2 boys. Do I feel like I wish I could have a girl? Yeah, I just would love to experience what it's like to be a mum to a girl. I want the weddings and all of those things. I want the grandchildren, because you always know with girls, don't you? They'll be like, Mum, I'm exhausted. Please, can you come and look after my child? And I'll be like, I'm downstairs. I haven't left your house since you gave birth to this child. Of course, I'll be up in 5 minutes. That's the kind of mother that I would be to a girl. But if you've had 3 daughters and then you have a little boy, I don't know, it just kind of creates this perfect family, doesn't it? Where you've got all the experiences. And I'm imagining that Peter's father would have been thrilled as well that he'd had a son. But in spite of what should have been a happy occasion, within 3 months after giving birth to Peter, she splits with his father. And I'll tell you why she splits with his father, because the thing is, it doesn't matter what look you are given in life. To some degree, you are a victim of certain circumstance when you've been brought up in horrifically dysfunctional relationships, particularly those that have extremes. So extreme highs and lows, extreme calm, then chaos, because you get so used to these swings of massive amounts of emotion. So in spite of the fact that she'd had this very stable life, 3 months after Peter's born, she is basically in a situation where she's attracted to somebody else. Simple as. So the separation's largely down to her meeting a guy called Stephen Barker. He was 30 at the time, and she met him in a pub. I know, traditionally romantic in the UK. Down the pub on an evening. But the point for me is that it suggests that even though she's really had the opportunity to have a life that could have been really good, there is something within her that is seeking that dysfunction. She hasn't put to bed those demons that she's been brought up with. And so instantly the connection that she feels with this Stephen Barker, even though it's not going to lead to anything positive, it's so intoxicating for her because it's very physically charged for a start. And it makes her seem in those early months visible. We all know what it's like when we've had kids. We all know what it's like when we become a parent. You're going through the motions of day-to-day life. It's wonderful in a billion ways, but you kind of do forget yourself a little bit. And you can forget that you are somebody who is beautiful, you are somebody who is validated, you are somebody who is worthy, because you know you're functioning day in, day out looking after children. And of course, somebody walks into your life and shines a light on you as an individual, and that can be very difficult to ignore. So this Stephen Barker, who she's met down the pub, just starts hanging around the house. So boundaries, very poor. I mean, you're married, you've got 4 children. What are you doing having a strange guy that you met down the pub hanging around your home? It's not appropriate. So we're being introduced, aren't we? Connelly's boundaries are not good. And also Connelly's understanding of the emotional pain that she could be causing her husband is something that's an oversight as well. Imagine having a guy that you're clearly attracted to hanging around the house with your kids when it's actually a place that you reside in with your husband. Totally inappropriate. And it causes the breakdown in Connelly's marriage, which I fully understand. And let me just bring in, what was the straw that ultimately broke the camel's back? Well, I'll tell you. And it's a bit of life advice. If you want your marriages to remain strong and you get an invite to your school reunion and you think, school reunion, married with kids, got a +1 on here, who shall I take? I'll take the strange guy I've just met down the pub. That won't raise any eyebrows or annoy my husband. That's what she does. I'm imagining how the conversations would go at that school reunion. How's it going, Connelly? Yeah, really good. Oh, is this your husband? Oh no, this is just some random that I met in the pub a few weeks ago and just thought I'd bring him instead. Yeah, Okay. Always thought you were a bit strange. Now you've confirmed it fully. So her husband moves out of the home at that point, but again, worth noting, early on, he stays part of Peter's life. So he is a very connected dad. He doesn't want to become a dysfunctional father, simple as. But obviously, we're now in a scenario where she has more access to the children. So shortly after the separation, this is in early 2007, Connelly begins an actual relationship with Barker. Is it shortly after the separation? Is it shortly after the separation? Is it? I mean, she took him to the school reunion. He was hanging around the house so much that her husband left her. I'm imagining that there might be some overlap. I'm just speculating. He was 6'4", so he was a muscular guy as well. This is an imposing man. And obviously, when we connect with a human being, very often it's our common values and our shared beliefs that allow us to fuse and bond. You know, it might be that I like photography. You're on your Tinder date and they're like, you know what I like? I like taking pictures of landscapes, and you're like, we should definitely get married. That kind of thing. Obviously, by the way, if you're on Tinder and somebody does like photography and you do, don't say that I said you should get married. It's not true. I'm being very sarcastic. You should at least know whether there are another 2 interests before you decide on absolutely fully committing to that relationship. I don't know, say eating at gastropubs and long walks in the rain, then Gretna Green, straight away. For those of you who don't know what Gretna Green is, you can just basically turn up and get married, I think. I have no evidence to say that's true, by the way. You probably have to go through some legal process, but in my head, that's what happens. But the interests between these two, I'm unsure may have been as firm, because he had an obsession with Nazis. Is it just me who thinks that would be an immediate conversation stopper? I don't even care if you've got a historical context interest with it. So as far as I'm concerned, if I was to sit down on my first date with somebody and be like, so, what do you enjoy doing in spare time on the weekends? Well, this might interest you. I like researching Nazis. I think I've left the stove on. Just, bye. That would be what would happen. Even if it was somebody who was just historically interested in it. I think it's weird, but clearly we're not talking about this in that context. By the way, apologies if you are historically interested and feel that I have just, I don't know, been negative about you. The Nazis scare me a lot, as do interest within them. But basically, he's interested in Nazis because he's a less than pro-social human being. And you have to ask yourself, the minute that you find this out, what the hell are you doing having your children, or potentially having your children around him? Also, he had an IQ of 60. This is low. It's a dangerous combination, genuinely. This kind of IQ level is classed as extremely low. In fact, it's categorised as a mild mental disability. So with respect, this is not the best combination, because you're talking about an intelligence level that doesn't necessarily discriminate in the way that it should when reading information, and it isn't as discerning and capable. Also, emotionally, the experience of that individual is probably going to be less sophisticated. You put those all together and you're going to potentially have some problems. People who actually knew this guy, they referred to him as a simpleton, which I know is not fair at all. Obviously, nobody deserves to be called a simpleton, but it demonstrates that capacity-wise, people who knew him did not consider him intellectual or capable to some degree. But obviously, Connelly, just at this point, I think, is interested in the way he looks. Genuinely, I think that was their main connection. I think she was highly attracted physically to him. That's the thing that really connects her. And this combination instantly, before I even go into it, all of you are thinking, well, this is not going to be a match made in heaven. And it isn't, because when you look at the backgrounds, we already have Connelly with this hugely complex, dysfunctional background, but Barker is also from a very abusive background. So as a child, he and another family member had actually suffered abuse at the hands of his older brother. His older brother was called Jason Owens. And it seems like this kind of abuse that he'd experienced made him feel very angry, to the point where he would actually follow on this behaviour by sadistically attacking others. And one of the things that police would later say about this man was that he was fascinated with pain. And this is deeply disturbing, right? Anybody who is fascinated with pain and is attacking other people, we're instantly drawn to the reality of violent offending, aren't we? Somebody who's enjoying seeing another person struggle. As a child, he fits a lot of the variables that we see when we're looking at individuals who become killers. So he tortured animals. One of the things that he would do, which I find unbelievable, I really do. Look, I know that when we're looking at our serial killers, we constantly talk about horrific murders of animals, and I'm saying murders because they're sentient beings, no one has a right to take their lives in that way, but the way that people like BTK hung cats or Dharma dissected animals, it's terrifying that they got pleasure from it. But this particular type of interest that this man had was to actually get frogs and then to skin them alive, and then he'd break their legs. That is excruciating to imagine, isn't it? To actually want to skin a frog alive and then to break its legs so it can't get away, to just inflict as much agony as possible onto that creature. Oh, it's drawn out and protracted. And the fact that it's drawn out and protracted suggests that he was trying to cause the most pain possible, and he enjoyed doing so. Now, according to Owen, Barker was also responsible for torturing their younger brother. So it seems like there was this dysfunction that ran through the siblings, and the way that Barker chose to actually deal with it was to then take the pain that he'd suffered and project that onto his younger brother. And tragically, the story that I'm telling you today, of course, about baby Peter, is that Barker is going to be an individual who starts to target baby Peter. That's essentially how this is going to play out. So now Connelly and Barker have got together in this horrifically dysfunctional relationship. He moves in to the family home in 2006, and I cannot for 1 minute get my head around how, even when this that I'm going to describe began, people in the authorities were not just going, this is totally out of order, inappropriate, this just makes no sense whatsoever. Because in 2006, in November, while she didn't actually tell the authorities that Barker was moving in, and the reason that she said that she didn't tell the authorities that he was moving in was because she said she was just terrified of social workers because of the experiences that she went through as a girl. She was just absolutely terrified of social workers, so she couldn't confide in them that this man was moving into her family home. Come on, we all know that's absolute BS. And I will tell you now, the police would agree with my perception of this. As far as I'm concerned and they are concerned, she just knew how to play the system. She'd been in care before, she'd dealt with social workers, she knew exactly how to deceive the authorities, she was very, very knowledgeable. And in fact, what I can tell you about her behaviour throughout this crime is, wow, this girl was a master manipulator when it came to deceiving the authorities. She knew how to play them, full stop. So she doesn't let them know about Barker because she doesn't want people investigating or looking into it. But if it's not bad enough that he moves in, bear in mind she's got 4 kids, remember? So this isn't a peaceful environment anyway. You know, there is clearly going to be quite a lot of chaos with 4 kids. Bringing another human being in who's highly chaotic is probably not going to be the best solution. But in spite of this, not only does she let Barker move in, she lets Barker's older brother, 34-year-old father of 4, Jason Owen. So he moves in June 2007. Just to give you a bit of background, aside from the fact that he's violent as a child, he's also a crack cocaine addict. He's a convicted arsonist and burglar, and he'd previously been accused of raping an 11-year-old girl when he was 13. He was also, like his brother, a hard, far-right sympathiser. He was a member of the National Front. He'd also been investigated because he'd been known to victimise an Asian family, and he'd actually changed his surname from Barker to Owen because apparently there'd been some kind of family dysfunction and he'd had a family argument. And then when he moves into Connelly's home, he actually moves in with 3 of his 4 kids. Yeah. He moves into Connelly's home with 3 of his 4 children. And I'm imagining that you're all thinking, what a great tenant this guy would be. If it wasn't that he's just far right and extremist as far as particular belief systems, he's a racist, he's a violent bully, he's a crackhead, and he's a sexual rapist molester. Gee, I'll definitely take him. Can we organise a 2-year rental scheme for this guy? He's totally pro-social. I can't imagine anything going wrong in this situation. What is she doing, letting this man even walk across the threshold? Seriously. And just to add a little bit extra, because I'm missing out a little point about this man. As well as Owen moving in 3 of his 4 kids, he wasn't actually alone as far as being with a partner when he actually moved in. Because he had left his wife, and at the time he was on the run with his 15-year-old girlfriend. Yeah. She was a runaway. Obviously, he's a pervert, so she's vulnerable. We can't blame that 15-year-old girl at all. She's just a victim without knowing. She can't consent to this relationship. But there they all are, moving into Connelly's place. Just think about how many kids and people there are in that situation, the amount of dysfunction I've just introduced there. So to put that into context, when they moved in, bear in mind, Connelly's got her own 4 young children. She had 2 large dogs of her own. They've got Barker's Rottweiler. They'd also got 2 snakes. I mean it, the place itself was a scene of utter filth. It was just beyond chaotic. And at this point, we have little baby Peter. He's 15 months old at that point. He was in a house with 7 other children. He was surrounded by dysfunctional adults that all got abusive backgrounds. And if you can imagine introducing an innocent, naive, beautiful child into a completely horrific environment, we have all the ingredients here. This is a perfect storm, isn't it? Now, Barker and Owen, you will be unsurprised with the backgrounds that I've talked about, were already known to the police. So in 1995, when I tell you this, you're going to be like, how are these people allowed to walk our streets? So back in 1995, they had been charged with GBH, grievous bodily harm. Why was that? I'll tell you why. They'd assaulted their 82-year-old grandmother. 82-year-old, elderly, vulnerable grandmother, and I'll tell you why. They decided that they were going to lock her in a wardrobe. They then violently shook the wardrobe, and the reason for that is they wanted her to change her will in their favour. We've all done it, haven't we? We've all done it. Got siblings, now want all the money. What are we going to do? Simple. We're just going to get grandma, we're going to put her in the wardrobe, we're going to shake the wardrobe around a bit. She'll be like, total change of heart, I'll absolutely leave you everything. I mean, if ever you want to get written out of a will, I imagine that's a great way of making that happen, isn't it? You know, after she stumbles out of the wardrobe and
gets her orientation back, gets them out, and then scribbles anything that indicates they're going to get 1 penny and just writes, I don't know, to my favourite granddaughter. Who knows? But the point is, you're not going to get very far doing that. But it demonstrates the level of malice, doesn't it, in these two men. Now, that case sadly got dropped the following year because she died of pneumonia. She'd been moved into a care home. So essentially, they could have been up for manslaughter to some degree because their actions had contributed to her death. And the police at the time, when she did die, said they were really stunned that they did avoid manslaughter because it turns out that they'd also attacked her on numerous occasions. Apparently, one of the times they wore masks. They basically wanted to scare her and then they beat her up. Can you believe that we're talking about somebody's grandparent? I mean, what does that say about the form of these individuals if they are so willing to torture and abuse an elderly woman? They're the most vulnerable in our society, aren't they? When you look at the variables, you've got children who are very young, you've got elderly people who are very old. They are very much the vulnerable. Apart from those who are highly disabled, etc., these individuals are the most vulnerable in our society. And if somebody is willing to be so violent towards them, it is just demonstrative of the kind of monsters that they are, in my opinion. It only takes a month after Barker moves in to Connelly's home that Peter begins to show what we would consider the telltale signs of abuse. This begins in December 2006. If I was a mother, if you were a parent, and you had moved somebody in and you suddenly start seeing that your child is getting bruised and is looking like they are dealing with some kind of aggression, you are going to be looking at what's changed, aren't you? You're going to be like, hang on a minute. He moves in and my child is now getting injured. I mean, at that point, if I had a cattle prod or a taser or just a big burly neighbour who could help me, the person, shall we say, would be removed from said environment and children before I called police. That is how a rational, well-adjusted parent acts in these situations. But that's not Connelly. Connelly is not most parents. So her concern is not safeguarding the welfare of her son. Instead, she decides that the way she's going to handle these signs of abuse is just to completely selfishly satisfy her own needs. Now, there is some research that suggests that when a mother's experienced an abusive upbringing herself, she can develop a narcissistic attitude. This will be in a very small minority of mothers, but nonetheless, this seems to be a link. And the reason we believe this is that the mother views the child as an extension of themselves. So they end up abusing or neglecting the child, so effectively subjecting them to exactly the same dysfunctional upbringing that they were exposed to themselves. So their lived experience is so different to other people's, and because of this, it's their child that suffers as the result. Now, one of the things that certainly changes when Barker walks into Connelly's life is that she becomes nigh on obsessed with him. And there are online entries that really validate this position. So in an online entry, she states that she was madly in love with the most amazing guy. I mean, isn't he like a far-right Nazi who literally can't really string a sentence together very effectively? Just throwing it out there. But like I said, I think for Connelly, it was the way he looked that was the connector. And what's terrible is she's writing these accolades to this amazing guy who's already abusing her son, and his welfare, Peter's welfare, is just getting lost entirely. This infatuation that she has with Barker is just bypassing any ration. It's just clouding any even insight into what's occurring in her home. And it's clear that he's abusing Peter at this point, and she's just choosing to completely ignore it. And in another post, November 2006, on a social media entry, she writes, It's funny when you meet someone and fall in love. You spend as much time as possible kissing and touching and having sex. You want to make them feel so good, just can't get enough of each other. It's great. Ugh. It's great if you are prioritizing your kids' needs above everything else, and then, I don't know, after 9 o'clock at night, when you go to bed, you have your fun, knock yourself out, that's fine. But we're talking about the fact that she is actively abusing her child by avoiding taking any responsibility for what's happening to him. Now, on an internet networking site, what Connolly also described, and she does sound like the perfect mum here, this is the kind of parenting skills that so many of us should go out and try to forge for ourselves. Because this is her advice. She describes how she spends the day drinking vodka, watching porn, and having sex with her new boyfriend. I have written lots of things online. I'm one of those individuals who likes to express my opinion at times. I have fallen in love before and felt very rose-coloured about life. It's temporary, guys, it's temporary. You know, thank God, otherwise you'd never get very much done, would you? But what I'm saying is we've all been in a situation where we fell in love or in lust, and for a period of time they can do no wrong. And you do think about lots of lovely things and sentiments, but the idea of thinking that you would take something like, I drink vodka, watch porn and have sex with my new partner, and feel that that was something you wish to express to anyone other than one another, maybe some close friends, is a bit weird as far as I'm concerned. Social media does not need to know that about you at all. Apparently the pair spent hours and hours and hours just locked in their bedroom having sex, just leaving the kids to their own devices. And yes, if I have had to research that and now I have those imagined images in my head burnt into my hippocampus, then I'm afraid you have to as well. It's a transactional deal. You're listening, I'm presenting, I don't need to hold this on my own, take some of my burden of those pictures in my head. But that's what they're doing. They're just kind of spending time on one another, and caring for their kids is just ultimately the last thing on their mind. They don't care at all. About this time, when dysfunction is just, wow, everywhere, Connolly's real father suddenly appears on the scene. I say father, I mean sperm donor. Literally, he had sex with her mother once, got her mother pregnant, I don't know, carried on sex offending elsewhere. This man is a real piece of work. But for whatever reason, there seems to be some kind of connection made, so he starts visiting her house from time to time. And draw yourselves back to what I've told you already about him. He's a registered sex offender. And he'd actually been convicted of raping a 14-year-old girl in Leicester. That was in the 1970s. Then he'd gone on to commit further sex offence in the 1980s. So this is a man who should not be around children at all. And yet she's letting him visit their home. Again, really poor boundaries. Absolutely no care, consideration or concern for her children. She's bringing a known sex offender into their home, putting her children at risk. Social services were involved, by the way, with this family to some degree, because Peter and two of his siblings were actually placed on the child protection register. But in spite of this, somehow Haringey Council were totally unaware of the other adults living in the property. I think that's down to the fact that they clearly were not visiting often enough, or if they were visiting, they were not doing them out of the blue. Like, if you're a social worker and you really want to find out what's happening in a home, just turn up unannounced. Don't let people know that you're going to come round. We've seen that play out in the Star Hobson case, where they were constantly alerted that social services were coming round, so they just hid the bruises and made Star look okay. That's what you're going to do, isn't it? You're going to be given a warning. But apparently, for whatever reason, the council just are unaware of this situation. There are adults in this house at this moment in time with abusive criminal past. They've got a history of drug addiction, and yet, even though these kids are on the child protection register, still they're having access to these kids. Also, the fact that, as I've said, a known sex offender, a convicted sex offender is visiting. These should all be enormous alarm bells. And if a child is on the child protection register, all of this should be being brought to the table. And let me tell you, it is so serious if you have a registered sex offender near your children, let alone all the other things that I've just talked about, including the two guys who beat the grandma up in a wardrobe trying to force her to change a will. They're going to remove those kids from home. And that would be something that certainly is in the interest of every child in that home. Connolly as well is not this innocent party in this scenario. She's not just some kind of fool who's inviting these idiots into her world. She's well aware of this. She's been involved with social services. She's been involved in residential care. She knows exactly what would happen. She goes out of her way at every single opportunity to hide these facts from the authorities. The authorities that are there not to harm her. They are there to protect her children. By keeping this information away from the authorities, she is purposefully and willfully making it possible for her children to be harmed. That's what makes her so heinous. She knows what is starting to go on. She's inviting the chaos into her world. And she can see that her own baby son is suffering physical abuse. These are in plain sight. I think at this point we're all going to be aware that I don't like them. I don't like any of them at all. I want to rewind time and run in and kidnap all of the children from that place. Genuinely. That's what it makes me feel like. All these children living under that roof with reprehensible human beings who were literally invited over the threshold by a mother who should have done so much more. It's impossible for us to comprehend the physical and the psychological abuse that baby Peter must have suffered in that hell house. When social workers wrote reports on their visits, they actually described the conditions as dirty, untidy, and smelling of urine. I mean, that in itself should make those children be placed elsewhere. It was also noted that when Peter was playing, he'd often be alone playing with toys, and they'd note that Connolly would just surf the net, watch television, basically be a lazy ass mother. Sorry, did I say that? I did say that. It's okay for parents to chill, I get it. Who doesn't need that sometimes? Who's not like, I just need a cup of tea and 5 minutes quiet? Because I do think that it is possible to self-combust. I've seen pictures where there are just smoking shoes and no body, where the person just seemingly has blown up to some degree. And I do think I'm only half a degree away from doing that myself. We've all been there. But this is constant. Connolly is somebody who just isn't engaging. In fact, I'm going to use how the police described her. So this is not me saying it. Before anybody is like, Emily, you're being negative. I'm not being negative. I am the conduit for explaining others' opinions. But I do like this opinion, and I felt I would keep it in, because it's the police who said it. They described her as a morbidly obese mother, a slob completely divorced from reality. Their words, not my words. A slob completely divorced from reality. They said as well that she was more devoted to her dogs than her kids, which I do have dogs and I'm highly devoted to them. But, you know, when it came down to saving people or dogs from a burning building, I'm gonna get my kids out first. Ideally, my kids will be holding my dogs at the time. You know what I'm saying though? The kids come first, even though you absolutely love your dogs. But the fact that she prioritizes them, well, that is, again, a really strange relationship. So, along with the neglect that we're clearly seeing at this moment in time, another thing that's a problem in the household is I brought in the fact that Barker's brought his Rottweiler, and he used that Rottweiler to terrify baby Peter on a regular basis. He liked terrifying that little boy, a little baby boy. And this grown-ass hulk of an excuse for a man is using a very scary looking dog, because even though Rottweilers are beautiful animals, when they are aggressive, they're scary, they're really scary, and it would tower over baby Peter. This is like a giant to him. Two giants, this 6'4" excuse for a human and this dog, and he's using it to just torture this baby. And if that's not enough for us to just, I don't know, want to spend half an hour in a room with this individual, he also starts this high-level physical abuse. And it's this high-level physical abuse that is going to do the real damage, create the most devastating impact. Because it's mind-blowing to me that anybody can do this to a child, but I want to tell you before I start going into the detail that probably what is equally as devastating is the missed opportunities. Because Peter was seen by a number of healthcare professionals a number of times, and it's striking that this got missed. And when you hear about the injuries, you'll understand that this child, this little boy, this little baby, the neglect and the abuse that he endured during his incredibly short life was terrifying. When he was seen by healthcare professionals as well, it's mystifying that links weren't made. I mean, he was seen countless times for nappy rash, diarrhea, vomiting. He was seen for lots of various infections. He had a lot of head lice that he'd go and see the healthcare providers with. This is going through a few of those episodes. So the 13th of October 2006, he's 7 months old at this point. He's seen by his GP for head and chest bruising. Now his mother has claimed at this point it's because he had an accidental fall down the stairs. I guess if that's the first time that a GP has seen him, it probably seems like a possibility that a kid could fall down the stairs, although I would be arguing, why is a 7-month-old anywhere near stairs to fall down? But GPs are busy, she was great at manipulating people, the GP must have believed her. Then on the 11th of December 2006, so remember, we're just 2 months after this, he gets admitted to hospital with bruising to the forehead, the nose, the sternum, the right shoulder, breast, and both buttocks. They said that as far as they were concerned, it looked like considerable force had been used to actually inflict these bruises. So they picked up on that. They could see that these injuries on a safeguarding level were not consistent with what we'd expect to see for a 9-month-old. So the following day, rightfully so, the hospital refer to the child abuse investigation team. This, rightfully so, absolute protocol followed, results in baby Peter being taken away. So he's placed into the temporary care of a relative, and his mother and grandmother actually end up getting arrested for assault. So the very fact that he's been placed in temporary care shows that at this moment in time, they're going through the due process. And it's deeply worrying, isn't it, that his own mother and grandmother are the people who've been arrested for assault. And also I feel like what's really sad is when you look back at what happened, you know, he's placed elsewhere, he must have been the happiest he'd ever been. When he was placed with that other relative and he was safe and fed and cared for and looked after, he must have just felt like everything had changed. He'd been taken from the jaws of those wolves and placed somewhere safe. Also, the hospital over time, they x-rayed Peter's leg numerous times, so he was always getting injured. And because of this situation, he was placed on the child protection register. As I said earlier, we know that this was endemic in his family. 2 of his sisters were already on the register. But bizarrely, and I have no idea why, no action was taken against Connelly. None. In fact, no action was taken against Connelly, but to add an even worse dimension to this, Peter gets returned to her care on the 26th of January 2007. It's by this point she's actually moved into a council house in Tottenham, and as you noted earlier on, social services aren't even aware that she's moved her boyfriend Barker in with her. On the 9th of April, this is 2007, he's 13 months old at this point, Peter, seen by his GP again. Bruising to the face, swelling to the back of the head, very worrying. Think about that, guys. He's got bruising to the face, but he's got swelling to the back of the head. So we're talking about some potentially life-threatening injuries at this moment in time, aren't we? Swelling on the back of the head? I mean, what's happened? Has he been swung into something? They said that it was noted he was clearly in pain. When the doctor tried to move and manipulate Peter's head, he was crying. And the way that his mother described it as well, because remember, she takes no responsibility, no accountability at all. She says that he got pushed into a marble fireplace by another child. Doctor also noted that Peter had got head lice again. And at this point, the doctor was concerned. So he notifies social services and he also admits Peter to hospital. So clearly, very alarmed at what's being presented. The next day, Peter's referred to a child development clinic and a social worker sees him and they note that he's headbanging. So I'm sure that some of you will have come across children that headbang. You may have a child yourself who has headbanged. You yourself may have been somebody who as a child headbanged. What it is believed the reasoning behind this is about is it's a self-comforting method. It's a soothing sign. So even though it looks bad, it's actually that the child is trying to self-soothe on one level. It can also be a sign of a developmental issue or even a method of pain relief. So even though instantly you look and you're like, oh, please stop doing that, you can read into a deeper level as to why the child is exhibiting those kind of signs. But it's noted. So we're seeing there is something going on in this child's life. That same month, a friend of Connelly's goes to her house and they note that when they saw baby Peter, he just looked really withdrawn. And they noted that baby Peter was actually sat in the garden and he was just eating dirt. That in itself makes you go, okay, look, hey guys, apparently I used to eat dirt. I'm sure a lot of you did. It's a weird thing that kids do. We haven't learned the social etiquette. You're not like that at 15, are you? You're like, hey, what are you doing, Emma? I'm just having a bit of this soil. It's just one of those days. But you know, when you're a kid, you're not thinking like that. I'm sure there are nutrients in the soil that you're probably lacking and therefore you're shoving it in your mouth. We see that kind of stuff happening. But for this child, it's just another indicator of this lack of care and compassion. And that person, that friend of Connelly's, was so taken with this that they obviously engage in a conversation with Connelly, and Connelly is actually really frustrated because she says that Peter has basically grown fond of the relative who'd been given temporary custody of him, and now he wanted to be cuddled all the time. She complained about a little boy, a mere baby, wanting to be cuddled all the time. No, you absolute imbecile. It's not that he wanted to be cuddled all the time. It's what children of that age want and need and deserve. You absolute excuse for a human being stroke mother. Let's not give you mother in the correct category because you don't frigging deserve it. I don't know what you are. I really don't know what you are. If you're watching this, I don't know what you are, but we'll stick with imbecile right now. On the 1st of June 2007, at this point, he's 15 months old. And fortunately, on one level, social services decide to do an unannounced visit. When they went to that place, to Connelly's home, they were really worried. And they actually reported Connelly to the police because they saw that Peter had bruises on him. When they found him at Connelly's, he was lying under a blanket on the sofa. His face was red, he had bruises under his chin, and let me tell you, on a safeguarding level, if you're finding fingertip bruises under the chin, that is a major red flag. In fact, when they looked at the bruises on his body, he had 12 bruises, he had scratches, he had cuts all over his body. They then take him to hospital, get him checked out, and Connelly is at this point arrested and is interviewed under caution by the police. And of course she denies hurting him. She even describes herself as a damn good mother. A damn good mother. So we can add pathological liar to our assessment of this human being. She's been arrested now, she's being questioned, and as opposed to just being like, I can't manage having this child, please place him with the relative who he was happy with, because you know what, at this point we're like, we can all have some sympathy and empathy for a parent who realizes they shouldn't be one and does something to redress the balance by making sure their kids get cared for elsewhere. But no, that isn't what Connelly is like. Instead, she just creates this absolute fabrication about how really she's a good human being and a good parent. On the 26th of July 2007, again, we're talking just a month after the last time, she goes to her GP with Peter because he's got head lice again, and also he's got blood in his ear. Now, the GP notes that the lice had actually caused a scalp infection. It was leading to some hair loss. So we're talking that this condition has not been managed at all. On the 30th of July, social workers go and visit Connelly's home. Now, bear in mind what I've told you about this absolute hellish list of injuries, of concern, of arrests. Just put that into context and then imagine being the social worker going to visit Connelly. Baby Peter is sat in a buggy in the hall and his face and his hands are just smeared with chocolate. Now the social worker notices that he does appear cranky and fidgety and is really restless, but she also notices that he smiles at them. Now, that breaks my heart. This little broken baby. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a little broken baby who's been so abused and neglected that he should be completely despondent. But instead, even though he's in pain at this moment in time, and I'll tell you he was in pain when that social worker went round, he smiles. He smiles. It later transpires that when that social worker went round and saw this child covered in chocolate, which I don't know, throwing it out there, wipe it off. Wipe it off, because number one, child shouldn't be smeared in chocolate. It's weird. They should be smeared in chocolate if they're eating a chocolate ice cream and you can physically see them doing it. If they've just been left smothered in chocolate, well, that says neglectful anyway. That would not mean that I was like, oh, well, he's got chocolate all over himself. Maybe I'll just leave him alone. Maybe do a bit more investigation, because it transpires that Connelly and Barker had basically smeared him with chocolate because he had bruises and injuries all over him. So they have gone out of their way to manipulate this situation. And bear in mind, this child could have gone into care at any point. They did not need to keep him in their home. If they did not want to care for him, they could have given his care to someone else. But this is why I think that Barker wanted him to be smothered in chocolate, because he's enjoying it. Connelly doesn't care, and Barker's enjoying it. little baby Peter is becoming Barker's punch bag. That's it. Heartbreakingly, and I mean utter heartbreak as far as when I was researching this, on the 1st of August 2007, this is when Peter is just 17 months old, just 17 months old. This is, by the way, following the further allegations of assault by his mother. So, you know, she's already been up for it a few times, and now we're at a point where police officers have kind of investigated her again because of these further allegations that she's being violent towards baby Peter. Senior police officers actually concluded that baby Peter should not be returned to her care, right? The police are saying, we don't want this kid going back to this parent. That's it, end of. But no. Haringey Council's lawyers, they stated that the evidence threshold to put him into care had not been reached. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Because I don't know how much further threshold could be required, because I'm thinking where he is now is at dire risk of either serious injury or death. So like, what is the threshold, Haringey Council lawyers? What is it? Corpses? Because as far as I'm concerned, baby Peter is at serious risk. How could there be an evidence threshold that was more serious than this? Peter ends up being seen at St Anne's Hospital in North London by consultant paediatrician Dr. Saba Al-Zayat. She did note that Peter was miserable and cranky. However, she had no other concerns. No other concerns. I'm a little bit concerned about your training. I'm a little bit concerned about whether you're really qualified, or did you buy your qualifications potentially off Google. Just throwing it out there. Anyway, no concerns. So the following day after there's a checkup, Connolly was told by the police that they would be taking no further action over the assault allegations. Again, no idea why. 1 minute, they reckon that the child needs to be removed from home. The next minute, lawyers got involved, doctor said it's fine. They're like, it's cool, you just carry on. Makes me really angry. I should not be talking about this case. None of us should be listening to this at all, because there were so many warning signs. It turns out by this point, by the way, that Peter had been used as a punch bag. Simple as that. He was being used on a regular basis as a punch bag by people who were meant to be caring for him. His mother did nothing to protect him. She'd allowed utterly reprehensible, horrific abuse to continue. And as you won't be surprised, Connolly and Barker's relationship, even though at the beginning it was so much fun, drinking vodka, watching pornography and having lots of sex, have realised that their relationship isn't actually that good, because you know what? He's a far-right Nazi and she's from the depths of hell, that apparently that's not a great mix. So there's a deterioration in their relationship, and who's going to bear the brunt of that? Damn straight. Little baby Peter. He's going to be the one that starts paying the price. It's around this time, by the way, that all that's going on, that we have Owen move in with his 15-year-old lover. So how this consultant paediatrician at this point missed the serious injuries that Peter had already sustained, I have no idea. I mean, a background check on previous injuries would have alerted anybody. I cannot comprehend how they were just like, nah, it's fine, just send him home. Those injuries that I'm talking about being missed, they'd soon be revealed, and they would be revealed in the most tragic of details, because that decision alone allowed Peter to return to that place of abuse and that place of absolute torture. On the 2nd of August 2007, Connolly's been up drinking. She's stayed up late. She's drinking cocktails. I'm not imagining they were classy cocktails. Probably just like, what happens if you put vodka and rum and whiskey and tequila and, I don't know, wine in a pint glass? Well, I'll call it a cocktail. I have no evidence that that's what she was doing. It's just sometimes the disdain just creeps through. So she's been drinking, and her online entry stated this: I was drinking cocktails and large vodka and cokes. I got really drunk like a twat. I suppose on one level, she does actually use an appropriate word to describe herself, so seems like even idiots can on occasion get something right. And then the following morning, because we know that she's not an attentive parent, she just does exactly the same as she's always done. She sleeps in late. This is the 3rd August 2007, 11:36 a.m. Emergency service get a call from Connelly. This is after she finally bothers to get out of bed. And when she goes to find her kids, because obviously she's a completely dreadful parent, but would at some point come into contact with her offspring, she finds Peter, and he's stiff and he's blue in his cot. 11:40 a.m. the paramedics arrive. They arrive at this dilapidated, semi-detached council house in Tottenham. They were absolutely stunned at the living conditions. They said that every single surface was just covered in thick layers of filth. They said that the place itself was just infested with fleas. On the table in the kitchen, there was a dismembered corpse of a rabbit. Am I describing a Netflix horror movie? Genuinely? If you were to walk into a home and you were like, ooh, this looks a bit dirty, looks at table, dismembered corpse of a rabbit, I mean, you're waiting, aren't you, to get a hatchet in the back of your head. But also, just demonstrates the kind of squalid conditions these kids are living in. And I have this horrible feeling of like, is the rabbit one that was bought to actually eat, or did somebody just take a pet rabbit and dismember it on the table, thinking about Connelly and his brother and their bizarre penchant for harm anyway? Also, they found animal and human feces on the floor. That's not enough to make them realise that they've just entered some kind of purgatory hellhole. They find Nazi paraphernalia, they find knives, they find replica guns. So they're just looking at this scene from a torture chamber, so to speak. And then when they go upstairs, they're met with baby Peter. His body is stiff, it's lifeless. Also, he's in a blood-stained cot. They find him wearing just a nappy. Obviously, at this point, they're desperate to know what's happened. They want to get him to hospital. They're rushing. Clearly, they are rushing. They are healthcare providers. They are paramedics. This is something that is their worst nightmare, to find a baby in this state. And they're literally trying as fast as they can to get baby Peter into the ambulance. And what does Connelly do? She says that they need to wait because she wants to get her cigarettes and she wants to brush her hair. You know how I was saying about self-combustion earlier on and just people's shoes being left? I wish you could do that with the power of your eyes to other people at times. The last thing she would have to worry about was her brush in that case. But it tells you how disassociated she is from this. This is her dead little boy, that beautiful, angelic looking child, that gorgeous, innocent baby. And all she can care about is getting her cigarettes and brushing her hair. Paramedics obviously try to resuscitate him, but it's totally unsuccessful. At that point, he's taken to North Middlesex Hospital. He's with his mother, even though he's dead. She's there in the ambulance with him. He gets pronounced dead at 12:20 p.m. He was 17 months of age. When they did the post-mortem, it was obvious straight away that they were dealing with a child who'd been tortured and abused for months. Months before that little body of his succumbed to his injuries. He had over 50 separate injuries. And some of those injuries were so obvious that it blows my mind that he was ever allowed to remain in that home, that any police would have dropped charges because part of his left ear was torn and missing. They think that that could have happened because he was literally hung by his ears. He also had a really infected raw area in front of his left ear. The tip of his tongue was missing, as was the tip of his right index finger. He got a torn frenulum, which is the bit of skin that connects the gum to the inside of the lip. And that would happen when there was a forceful impact to the face. All of his fingernails and one of his toenails had been deliberately removed. Literally, he'd been tortured. I can't tell you that as I am saying these words, I have so many swear words going through my head that I want to project at his assaulters that it's kind of distracting. I can't because I won't be allowed to actually be on YouTube if I use the words that I want to use. But these in itself show you that his torture has been protracted, drawn out, consistent. He has been used to harm in the most heinous as ways by these horrific excuses for humans. And that's not the worst of his injury. The most serious injury was that he had a broken back. They believed that the way his back would have been broken would have been down to hyperextension. So from being stretched over a knee or over a banister or over his cot. And they said that the force that would have been used to sustain that injury was equivalent to a car crash. Remember what this excuse of a man who's been torturing him is like. It's a 6'4" hulk of a guy. So he's got force. He also had 7 ribs that were broken, and ribs are really painful. But when it comes down to children breaking ribs, the reason this is quite uncommon is because when you're a child, your ribs are quite pliable. So to actually break a child's ribs, wow, you need to use some force, you really do. And they believe that the way that they would have broken his ribs would be to have squozen his chest really tight. He also had a fractured shin bone, which had been inflicted some months before his death. His fingers and his toes were blackened from cigarette burns. There was soft tissue missing from his right middle finger. He'd lost one of his left incisor teeth, and that was definitely a result to the blow that he experienced the day before he died, because his tooth was actually found in his colon during the post-mortem, so he'd ingested that tooth. Also, he'd got significant weight loss. When they looked at what actually killed him, they said that the cause of death, as far as they could establish it, was from the broken spine and the internal bleeding that broken spine caused. What is utterly mind-blowing is that most of those injuries that I've just told you about, they were present when the consultant examined him 2 days before. And that consultant was a consultant pediatrician, an expert apparently in their field. You know, apparently he was just a bit miserable and cranky. Was he? Was he just a bit miserable and cranky, or did he have a broken back and 7 broken ribs? Miserable and how the hell do you miss that? In the week before Peter actually died, Peter had stayed with his father and his grandmother. They noticed that his hands had been bandaged, and they noticed that he had bruises and cuts on his head. But they were under the impression that medical authorities were completely aware of his injuries. So they didn't take him to hospital. They imagined that it was being dealt with. When his father returned Peter to his mother, there's absolutely no way that he could have imagined for even a second that that would be the last time that he'd ever see that gorgeous little boy alive again. He said that as he was leaving, baby Peter was apparently screaming, "Daddy, Daddy." He was reaching for him. In hindsight, we all know He was screaming and reaching for his father because he was terrified. He knew he was being returned to a place of pain and suffering, and he was just screaming for help. Help that his father would have given him. Help that without question would have come if they hadn't trusted that Peter was being properly looked after, was being investigated appropriately. What a horrible memory for Peter's dad. The last time that he ever saw his son was begging him for help and he just didn't realise. Police obviously immediately launch a murder investigation. It's clear that the inquiry is leading to the fact that their caregivers have been involved in the death. Connelly gets arrested the day of baby Peter's death. At the time, she was pregnant with her 5th child, because it seems that even though these individuals should not be able to procreate, they somehow have the easiest opportunity and ability to do so. Barker and Owen at this point, well, they fled. They fled Tottenham entirely. They realised that there's going to be some kind of repercussions. They actually get arrested at a campsite in Epping Forest 11 days later. And the reason they get arrested is the campsite owner recognises them and calls the police. Unsurprisingly recognises them. I mean, they're not exactly shrinking violets character-wise, and the fact that a 6'5", slightly Naziist guy is parading around a campsite would have drawn attention without a doubt. So thank God that person alerts that these individuals are present, and at this point they're all charged with murder, and they're charged with causing or allowing the death of a child. Now, contrary to Section 5 of the Domestic Violence, Crime and Victims Act 2004, all 3 pleaded not guilty to murder. Barker and Owen also pleaded not guilty of causing or allowing Peter's death. Although I will say that at this point Connelly did plead guilty to this charge, but yeah, apparently none of them had anything to do with it, apart from Connelly said, oh, I kind of did allow Peter to die, but I wasn't actually involved in the killing. All right, okay. So this child just died in your home, horribly injured, and you knew nothing about it. Well, maybe a little bit, but I didn't know it was actually going to kill them. But no, I accept that maybe I could have done more. That's basically what she's doing. And the guys are like, yeah, I have no idea how it happened. Oh. Must be really infuriating to be a police officer in these cases. It really must be. During questioning, Owen actually claimed that on the day that baby Peter died, he'd gone into the child's room to find his brother Barker sweating and excited whilst he saw Peter lying lifeless in his car. And Barker denies this allegation, and he says, sorry, I know I'm laughing, but I'm not laughing at the situation. I'm laughing at the incredulous nature of what Barker says, because Barker just denies this allegation, and he says, I have never laid a finger on Peter. If anyone says I admitted killing Peter, they are lying. Really? I can imagine that they're just like, oh, well, he said he didn't do it, so we should just totally move on. What is going on with people like that? I mean, all the evidence is clear, and yet this person is still believing that they can completely get away with it. So because of these not guilties, there is going to be a trial. The trial commenced at the Old Bailey at the end of 2008, and during the course of the trial, well, the murder charges against Connelly and Owen are dropped. The judge basically says that there's no case to answer due to insufficient evidence. I don't get it. I think there's a lot of evidence. I know legal eagles, you'll come on and be like, yes, but you cannot say that there was an intention to murder in that moment. I get it. But I think if you cause loads and loads and loads and loads of injuries that result in the death of a child, you should be done for murder, in my opinion. But anyway, that's what happens. So that insufficient evidence to say that they actually carried out a murder meant that they don't go on trial for murder. During the actual trial, you will not be surprised to know that the 3 defendants do what every single criminal does and just turn on each other. They basically all minimise their role that they played in Peter's death. They all go ahead and just say it's the other person. They had nothing to do with it. Connolly goes as far as to, bear in mind, Connolly, as we know, has been investigated herself by the police for being abusive and has had her child removed, and yet for some reason believes that in spite of this obvious evidence, she'll be like, I have never abused my child. So she said that she had no idea of the abuse that her son was suffering at the hands of his boyfriend and his brother. So she's nothing to do with it. Now in court, there's loads of evidence of her manipulative nature, shall we say. So one of the things that was noted is that when the jury was out, she just spent loads of time playing with her hair, looking bored, looking oblivious. But the moment that the jurors came back in, she just put on this really anxious face of concern. She dabbed her eyes, she cried. So she was a lot of play acting there. They actually, in court, brought up a computer-generated image of the head and facial injuries that baby Peter sustained. And the reason they did that was because the actual injuries that baby Peter did sustain were so distressing that they felt that they would just be too difficult and too traumatic to show. When they showed the images, I mean, it just showed the extensive bruising, the extensive cuts that he'd suffered. But it's really surprising to me that they decided not to show the actual genuine images, because lots of cases are horrifically traumatizing for the juries. But it can also be really helpful to see the actual injuries. It makes it more personable, it makes it more real. But understandably, it is the court's right to make a decision that those individuals shouldn't go home with those images scorched into their memory. Now, ultimately, Barker was found not guilty of baby Peter's murder, although both he and Owen were found guilty of causing or allowing his death. Following the trial, Connolly and Barker appear in court again in April 2009. You know why they were in court in April 2009, guys? Because allegedly they had anally raped a 2-year-old girl. Yeah, this had allegedly taken place before baby Peter's death, and it's not clear who the child actually was, but she did live in the property with Connolly and Barker, so most probably it was baby Peter's older sister. According to that incredible child, that brave, courageous little girl, Barker raped her numerous times in her mother's bedroom. Also, Connolly was allegedly aware of what was happening and had actually told Barker to stop it. So as far as I'm concerned, she is also part of the problem. She is a child molester as well. Yes, she has not directly molested a child, but she has given access to and enabled a child molester to rape a child in her home. That 2-year-old little girl, they became the youngest sexual abuse victim to give evidence at the Old Bailey. And the child actually was able to tell the court this: I was asleep and he woke me up. He was being naughty. He pulled my clothes down. Hell does not have a furnace hot enough for this kind of human. To avoid the jury actually linking them, by the way, to baby Peter's case, because they felt that would have prejudiced the jury. What is wrong with prejudicing the jury in this case? Sorry, we've got a child rapist who is now in the line of fire for the death of another child. Why can we not link that case? Sorry, of course it would have prejudiced the jury. It would have prejudiced the jury accurately and appropriately. I know that's not how the law works. I'm just saying I find it very frustrating. So they end up trying these two under assumed names, the names Young and Wilson. Barker was ultimately convicted of rape, but Connolly was cleared of a child cruelty charge. I have no idea what was going on in the brains of the jury, but fine, maybe the defence was amazing, maybe the prosecution wasn't very good. The sentencing for both the trials together took place on the 22nd of May 2009, that's again at the Old Bailey. Before the trio were actually sentenced, Connolly sent a handwritten letter from her cell in Holloway Prison to Judge Stephen Kramer. She wrote this, and I know you're all desperate to hear this particular piece of, shall we say, Shakespearean type writing. Dear Judge, I'm writing this as I'm not sure of a better way to express my regret at failing my children. I accept I failed my son Peter, for which I pleaded guilty. By not being fully open with the social workers, I stopped them from being able to do a full job. As a direct result of this, my son got hurt and sadly lost his short life. I'm never going to see my lovely son grow into the lovely, sweet man I believe he would have been. I have lost all I hold dear to me. Now, every day of my life is full of guilt and trying to come to terms with my failure as a mother. I punish myself on a daily basis, and there is not a day that goes by where I do not cry at some point. I have let down my family, my ex-husband, myself, and most importantly, my darling son. Whilst I appreciate I am going to get a custodial sentence, I would like to say sorry. I can only hope and pray my family, my ex-husband including, can one day forgive me for my mistakes. However, I can never forgive myself for my shortcomings. I am truly sorry. I can imagine the judge, I don't know, set that on fire when they got it. But can you hear the lack of remorse in that? It's all about her and trying to get a bit of a lenient sentence, isn't it? It's like, oh, I'm really sorry. I've let everybody down. I've let my ex-husband down. I've let my school down. I've let my church down. I've let my dog down. No one cares, you child killer. Anyway, ultimately, Judge Kramer surprisingly didn't believe that Connolly knew nothing of Peter's abuse. He said that her claims defied complete belief, and instead he described her as a selfish, calculating and manipulative human being. In fact, he said this: I am satisfied that you acted selfishly because your priority was your relationship with Barker. She received an indefinite prison sentence for public protection with a minimum term of 5 years. Really makes me angry, because even though we say indefinite prison sentence, as far as I'm concerned, a minimum of 5 years is very low. I mean, my son recently was a victim in the theft of a moped and quite a violent robbery. One of them got 7 years, one of them got 5 years. We're talking about a little boy's life, horrifically cut short in the most torturous of ways, and she's got a minimum term of 5 years. Barker, well, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for the rape conviction, and he got a minimum term of 10 years. Also, he received a 12-year sentence for his role in baby Peter's death to run concurrently. Owen, so his brother, he was jailed indefinitely, but he got a sentence of having to serve at least 3 years. Apparently, he was more worried about being discovered at the house with his underage 15-year-old girlfriend than protecting Peter. So he wasn't really concerned about what was going on as long as he got to have it away with his underage girlfriend. Like me, when talking about this sentence, understandably, it got a lot of widespread criticism. It really did. But despite that criticism imposed on all of the three defendants, in this case, in spite of the fact that pretty much on fire throughout the UK, when these sentences were given, people were losing their minds over the leniency, and you would imagine that the defendants would be like, what? That seems very reasonable for the heinous crimes that we've committed. Maybe we should just be like, thank you, just going to back away now because really appreciate the fact that you've given us such pathetic sentences. They all went on to appeal them. Now, Owen's sentence was subsequently changed to a fixed term of 6 years. So essentially, that didn't work very well for him. He went and appealed it, and he got an extra 3 years put onto his sentence, not less. Anyway, none of those three defendants, by the way, have ever accepted responsibility. for baby Peter's abuse and death, none of them. Now, due to the notoriety of these crimes, one of the things that was talked about was the fact that because everybody knows about the baby Peter case, the baby P case in the UK, their public protection may be limited in the fact that people do not like child killers. Simple as. So Connolly, Barker and Owen would potentially be given new identities. Bear in mind, they would be given new identities at the public expense. So when they're released from prison, the suggestion is, oh, it's going to be too dangerous for them to walk around, therefore let's allow them to have a whole new identity in disguise. Connolly initially gets released in 2013. She then gets sent back to prison 2 years later for breaching her parole conditions. And one of the things that she breached her parole conditions over is apparently she sold naked pictures of herself. Oh, she was in there before OnlyFans, wasn't she? I mean, all that says to me is there is a market for everything, genuinely, because who would want to buy those? She subsequently, after being returned to prison, was refused parole in 2015, 2017, 2019 too, but in March 2022, she had a fourth attempt at parole and it was successful. So she's literally no longer apparently considered to be a threat to the public. So she was due to be released in May this year. And when that came up, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab actually tried to block her release. It's literally one of the only times that me and a government minister have agreed on anything in a very long time.
In light of the Parole Board's direction to release Tracey Connelly, I should inform the House that having carefully read the decision, I've decided to apply to the Parole Board to seek their reconsideration. I believe the focus in this critical decision-making has become adrift from its original moorings. So this government will anchor Parole Board decision-making back to the cardinal principle of public protection. When it comes to assessing the risk to victims and public safety, we will introduce a precautionary principle to reinforce public confidence in the system.
In spite of the fact that me and Dominic Raab have had a massive meeting of minds over our attitude to whether this woman should be released, it is imminent. At the time of my recording, she is only weeks away from being released. Don't get me wrong, there are lots of licence conditions that are attached to her release. I believe around 40. These include things like having to be at a specified address, being under a curfew, being somebody who has to wear an electronic tag, reporting in constantly so that people are aware of her movements, avoiding certain places and people to keep victims and children safe. These are all things that have been written into her licence. That said, at the end of the day, it still means that she's free. She's walking the streets. And it's kind of chilling when you think about the kind of form that this woman has and the fact that she's shown no remorse her entire life. Nonetheless, let's hope that the licence conditions, I don't know, are so stringent that if she sneezes in a row 3 times, she gets taken straight back to prison. Sometimes you'll find that licence conditions are written like a noose so that somebody can hang themselves with it. I'm just saying, if I was writing those conditions, that might be the case. But it is really upsetting that she is going to be free after doing what she did to that poor little boy. Owen was actually released in 2013, but he then went back to jail because he had a parole breach. Now, he is believed to be living under a new identity, which really annoys me, but never mind. Now, I don't know the specifics of the case because I wasn't at the trial. But for me, it feels as though Barker and his brother basically got away with murder. As far as I'm concerned, they got away with murder due to insufficient evidence. There is no doubt whatsoever that baby Peter was tortured, he was beaten for months, and he was beaten so badly that in the end his injuries killed him. In addition, Barker raped a 2-year-old girl. So as well as causing or massively contributing to a child's death, he's also a molesting paedophile. To me, it seems beyond incredulous that he received a minimum term of 10 years for these reprehensible, heinous, unforgivable offences. Also, whilst in prison, one of the things that I found out is he's just refused to engage in any treatment programmes, which to me says, right, well, you know what, rot in hell, stay there. If you're not going to engage in any treatment programmes, if you don't think you've got a problem when you've been involved in a child death and a rape of a 2-year-old, you should not be allowed out. You are not taking responsibility. There's no accountability there. He actually got denied parole in March 2021, and the reason for that is they said that he's not willing to confront his crimes. Damn straight, don't ever let him out. At least it is gratifying to know that Barker will have a miserable time in prison. He will. Other inmates do not take kindly to child killers and paedophiles. Apparently he was attacked in December 2009 and he was felled with a single punch by another prisoner. So it seems like he's not quite as tough when he's facing somebody his own size. Now, after Baby P's, in my opinion, murder, but unlawful death, shall we say, there was a serious case review launched, and rightfully so, because it's terrifying the failures that were involved here. So they were seriously critical of authorities that had been involved with baby Peter and with his family. Social workers and police had failed essentially to save Peter, despite him being on Haringey Council's child protection register. You know, during 8 months alone, 8 months, during, by the way, his time of abuse, he was seen 60 times by health or social workers. He was removed from Connolly's care on a total of 3 occasions. Ultimately, he got returned each time. The final occasion that he was returned was just 2 months before his death. Now, Haringey Council had already, by the way, been found to be negligent in its protection of Victoria Klimbay 7 years earlier. Think about this, it's same council. Victoria Klimbay, it's a massive case in the UK. Horrific abuse that happened to that child that was just completely, shall we say, ignored, or at least not treated in the way that it should have been treated. She was an 8-year-old Ivorian girl. She had been tortured, she had been sexually abused, and then she was murdered by her great aunt and her boyfriend. Where are the lessons that have been learned? We're talking about the same council. Now, Sharon Shoesmith, the local authority's Director of Children's Services, she ends up getting sacked by a panel of counsellors following the investigation. And she was actually told that when she was sacked that she would never receive any compensation. So, of course, like every diligent professional who realises that maybe they haven't done a great job, she sued. Anyway, she sues, ends up with an unfair dismissal case, wins it and receives a 6-figure payout. Of course she does. Let's just reward incompetence. Several others actually ended up losing their jobs. So Haringey's Council's Deputy Director of Children's Services, 2 other managers, a social worker, all of them were dismissed following the investigation. Now, even though all of that played out, and whilst it is easy, let's be honest, to blame the authorities, and certainly in my case the medical professionals, at least a few of the medical professionals involved in this case, one of the things that we have to remember about it is that we have Connolly, who is an absolute manipulator. I'm not forgiving the failures. Baby Peter should be with his dad growing up, simple as that, or in care of another family relative growing up. But the truth is, even though we can lay blame to certain circumstances of his abuse not being brought into the limelight by the correct medical practitioners who should have then made him safe. We can say that, we can see that. We have to remember what Connolly was like. She continually concealed the extent of the danger that Peter was in. The way that she operated was she wanted to prevent her abusive partner being brought to any form of justice. She didn't want her little living situation disrupted. So she constantly manipulated social workers, police, health professionals. The fact that she smeared Peter in chocolate to cover his bruises. She also constantly deceived the authorities by looking like she was cooperating with them. You know, she took Peter to the doctors when he was ill. She attended parenting classes when she was told that she needed to, but all the time she was doing that, she knew that her son was being abused, and she was abusing him as well. She also hid the fact that Barker and his brother were actually living in the property. Also, she didn't let them know that her biological father, who was a known sex offender, was visiting her property. So she withheld so much information. And she was actually concerned that Peter's father wouldn't approve of the relationship that she was in, because he may have seen that as the reason their marriage broke down, and that he would have complained, meaning that her benefits would have been cut because she was claiming to be a single mother, whilst, I don't know, letting a million other people living there, most of them known sex offenders. But it really grates on me that her concern was the fact that she may lose money. What? So she couldn't afford to drink vodka, watch porn, and lie in bed with her boyfriend until all hours of the day? Whilst I've been talking about this case, it just flashes into my mind that I'm talking about this little beautiful baby boy. And I don't think that those heinous humans were given sentences that their crimes deserved to be given. I think they got off easy. I think that little baby Peter deserved more justice, personally. This case is utterly heartbreaking. It's a tragic, heartbreaking case. It highlights serious issues in our society, you know, from the cycle of economic deprivation and the abuse that at times seems to pass down from generation to generation. Connolly's mother had been physically and sexually abused as a kid. Connolly was then physically and sexually abused when she was a child. Her children were then physically and sexually abused as well. Furthermore, to be honest, their abusers themselves had also experienced childhood abuse. And it raises some serious questions, doesn't it? Whether the state should actually intervene more often to remove children from these potentially dangerous, damaging situations. Because they get a lot of crap when they do. There's a lot of negatives that are thrown at social services for removing kids from homes. But we look at these cases and we're like, when it comes down to child safety, is safe better than sorry? Certainly in this case, in Victoria Clembe, in Star Hobson, in Arthur Lambinos, all of these demonstrate that it's better to be safe than sorry. It's very easy for me at this point to just lay all the blame on social services for baby Peter's death. After all, there were clear signs of abuse missed. There were loads of opportunities to save him. But we also have to, in the same moment, acknowledge the chronic underfunding of child services and the ridiculous workloads social workers have to try and manage. I cannot express to you guys, if you don't work in social services and you haven't come across the kind of caseloads that these individuals have to carry, they're horrific. Genuinely. It surprises me when I hear that people are becoming social workers, because the burden that they have to carry and also the liability they carry when things go wrong is terrifying. They cannot possibly diligently manage the amounts of cases that they're meant to manage. So yes, they get highlighted or sacked or made to be seen as the villain in the professional piece. But I'm telling you now, it's absolutely impossible, genuinely, for these individuals to do a diligent job when they are so crippled by caseloads. In fact, the only kind of area of social services that I think social workers feel some kind of positivity is when they go into adoption, when they're actually dealing with creating adoption placements and they get to see the joy. The rest of the time it's absolutely harrowing. And my hat goes off to social workers, it really does. And like I said, I'm the first person to call these things out and call these systems out, but the underfunding that is involved is appalling. We need miles more social workers so that cases can be dealt with better. At the end of the day, if we have children, the real responsibility lies with the parent, doesn't it? The primary responsibility is with those who raise them, protect them, nurture them. It is on the parent, it is not on the state. It is the job of the person who has brought them into this world, or the persons, ideally, to take responsibility. Now, Connolly, I'm going to sound quite prejudicial when I say this, but screw it. This case is fitting of judging these people this way. I think that Connolly is a product of a culture that constantly takes from society and just expects society to do all of the heavy lifting for them, so they can just live their miserable, non-pro-social, self-indulgent, egocentric lives like big, stupid, dangerous kids with zero life skills. She had zero life skills, in my opinion, aside from, I suppose, an ability to just reproduce at an alarming rate. Sorry, that's how I feel about her. She was also very good at manipulating the system. She really was. At the end of the day, when you think about the state itself, yeah, they're held to account and that council's been held to account, but remember, they are under-resourced, and the more that the state intervenes, the more it's required to intervene, and therefore, because of the fact that there is these substandard opportunities for working because of caseloads, it means that there's more chance of error, doesn't it? So they get involved more, but also there is far more opportunity that the provision itself is going to be substandard. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Baby P was not tortured and killed by social services. He was tortured and he was killed by the very adults whose job it was to care for him. In this way, he was failed, he was ignored, he was neglected, and finally he was killed in the worst way imaginable. As simple as that. This case has literally no rays of hope. Sorry. I believe that the killers got away with a crime that they should not have got away with. I appreciate that one of them is still in prison. I appreciate that when it comes down to it, some of you will feel that even though these human beings failed on every level, they still deserve to be protected to some degree, hence why potentially they're being given new identities. But all I can feel when I'm saying that to you is, they aren't the victims. They still get to breathe, they still get to live their life. But that beautiful little boy, that little boy that pretty much every single person watching me now would have given a home to, if not all of you. He had his life stolen, snuffed out by these excuses for humans. And if you can do that to a child, if you can abuse a child over months and months and months to a point where they die, the level of malevolence in your being is truly terrifying, because that is the most vulnerable type of human being. And to systematically watch them in pain and to clearly enjoy that pain, removing their fingernails one by one, burning them with cigarettes, what does that say about your nature? And whether you are a bystander watching that happen or the active torturer, you still fit the same paradigm. You are a predator. And your history and your past pain in childhood, it doesn't cut it. Because there are so many of us who come on this channel and talk about our trauma. And all any of you feel is empathy, compassion, kindness, care, consideration, love for even those you don't know, but you wish you could have protected. I don't think 1 pence should be spent on these individuals when they come out of prison fully. I believe that they chose their sentence through their actions, and they need to pay for that, no matter what the consequence is. I hope you found today's case at least interesting as far as understanding it and the backgrounds of those individuals who were involved in the actual killing. I'm sure that a lot of you feel as frustrated as I do, please leave me your comments. Let me know. If you've liked my content, please give me a like, subscribe. I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. Also, if you like my Do Not Comply top, they're new. They're out now. Let me know your thoughts. Take care, and as ever, when it comes down to these cases, guys, this is absolutely for Peter. A beautiful, beautiful boy whose life got stolen. Whose life got stolen.